So next on your neuron note sheet is number 8, and it talks about all neurons are unidirectional. So I put an example on the board here. Here is just a typical, neuron, dendrites, axon, and the synapse, the space between it. And so here are all the neurons spaced out, and they're going in one direction. So they're taking the electricity out somewhere. And so if I had electricity, this is the way it would be going, right? It's gonna go this way and out. So everything's going this way. And then if you want to turn the electricity around, you have to have what we call an interneuron. An interneuron is the neuron that's on the corner that actually will flip the electricity to go the other direction. So here it comes and it'll go back this way. And so that's what it means unidirectional. All the neurons are lined up like little railroad cars, and then you've got one that's going to turn it around, the electricity around, called interneuron, and it's just a plain old neuron, dendrites and axon, and then here's the space, and then the electricity is going to go back in a unidirectional pattern. So that's a pattern. So unidirectional is the term for all the neurons going one way, and then they turn around and come back one way. Exactly. Now, going on in the note sheet, the next thing is we have, I think this is number 9 on your sheet, we have some directional terms for which way the electricity moves, okay? And so I drew a guy here, or a girl, it doesn't make any difference, somebody. And so basically I have a brain and a spinal cord, great. And then I have an arm and a hand, and you just touch something hot, okay, something hot. So now the electricity, you just touch something hot, and that's gonna create electricity. It's gonna make the salts move in and out and move the electricity. So the electricity is gonna come in here to the spinal cord, it's gonna go up the spinal cord, up to the brain, and it's gonna say, my gosh, you just touched something very hot. Take your finger off of it. And so the interneuron will turn the electricity around, and then the electricity comes back down another set of nerves, and these nerves go out to your finger, and then you're gonna have a reaction. You're gonna have a reaction. And so what are the names for the electricity, the nerves that carry the electricity into the central nervous system, into the spinal cord and up to the brain? These are always called afferent or sensory nerves. Sensory because you just felt something, okay? They're reacting to the environment, and so the environment will create the electricity on the surface of the body or in the inside of the body, and it will create electricity, and then these red nerves, the afferents or sensory, will take it into the spinal cord. Spinal cord takes it up to the brain, and then the brain decides what you're going to do with that electricity. And then it's going to turn the electricity around and then take the electricity down and out, and then you're going to have a reaction, right, to whatever is the stimulus. And so the nerves that come down take the electricity away from the central nervous system. These are all called efferent because they're exiting the brain and spinal cord, or they're called motor because they're going to create a movement or some sort of reaction in the human body, okay? So those are the terms, afferent and sensory, and efferent and motor go together. All right, now the last CT wrappers in nerve tissue, which are very similar to the muscle CT wrappers. So I drew a bunch of neurons right here, neurons, individual neurons, and basically every neuron has to have loose CT around it with the capillaries in it, so it can be fed, and then waste material can go back out into the capillaries. So what do we call this individual wrapper of loose CT? Well, it's basically called the endoneurium, okay? And so muscle cells had the same thing. Every muscle cell had a layer of loose CT around it, and so basically that was called endomysium in muscle. All right, then you have to bundle a group of muscle cells together, And so basically here is the orange layer going around, and the orange layer is dense reg CT making a bundle, and the bundles are called fascicles, just like in muscle tissue. So what do we call this CT wrapper made out of dense reg CT? Perineuron. And then once you create a couple bundles of nerve cells, then you're going to wrap it all together like one big present right here. And that's going to create a nerve, essentially. And so this is simple squamous and dense reg CT out here. Simple squamous and dense reg going around to basically dense reg CT make a huge nerve. So then this whole thing will make the nerve, right? Whatever nerve you're talking about. So basically, that last term we're going to use is epineurium. That's going to surround all the bundles and make the nerve. Now we're going to go over the neuroglial cells that are on the back of the nerve tissue sheet. And so we're going to talk about the first three that are associated with a neuron. And so the first one is always on the axons, all right? And so do all axons have to have this first support cell? No. But pretty much 90% of your axons do have these fat cells associated with the axon. So what are the names of these cells? They're called oligodendrocytes if they're in the CNS, and they're called Schwann cells if they're out in the PNS system. And so what tissue makes up these cells right here? Adipocytes. So it's adipose CT cells. And we have a name for the fat in the fat vacuole on the inside. It's called myelin, M-Y-E-L-I-N. And myelin is actually a form of cholesterol right there. And so many of these fat cells hooked together here on the axon are sometimes called the myelin sheath, okay? And so I'm not going to use that term, but that's what they're referring to. Many adipocytes or Schwann cells that are on the axon creating a myelin sheath. So it's sort of like a blanket over the axon. Now, in between each fat cell, basically there's going to be a little space on the neurolemma, the cell membrane, and we have a name for that famous little space between the fat cells. It's called the Node of Ranvier. And so this is where the cell membrane is exposed so the electricity can jump to it. So what's the function of these fat cells on your axons? Well, essentially the electricity is going to come here on the axon. It's going to arrive at the hill right here, right at the hill. And so as soon as it bumps up against a fat cell, the electricity jumps. It actually jumps to this little space on the nerve cell membrane right there. And then when it hits another fat cell, it just jumps like that. And then it's going to jump to another node of Ranvier. And then eventually it just goes down to the terminals, and then it's going to release the neurotransmitter. So essentially these adipocytes, they make the electricity move much faster than going straight down an axon with no fat cells. And so the fat just makes it bump and go faster, makes the sodium chloride and the potassium chloride exchange faster, and bam, 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 it's all the way down very, very quickly. And so that's the function of the first neuroglial cell. Now the second neuroglial cells, they're going to be called astrocytes or satellite cells, and they look like star-shaped right here. And what kind of tissue makes these up? Loose CT cells. So these are going to be loose CT cells right here, loose CT cells. And I drew a couple of them right here. And there's always capillaries in loose CT. And so here are the capillaries, and they're going to deliver oxygen, all the good stuff, food, and hormones. And so the capillaries will leak out oxygen, food, and hormones into the astrocytes. And then all the good stuff will be moved over by diffusion or active transport into the neuron, So it's almost like they eat the food first, and then they give it to the neuron as a form of protection, all right? And so that's what the astrocytes or the satellite cells do. So they're called astrocytes when they're in the CNS, and when they're in the PNS, satellite cells. So they have something to do with like outer space, get it? All right, so those are those two cells right here, the astrocytes or the satellite cells. They look exactly the same in both nervous systems. All right, now once you feed a cell and give it oxygen, it's going to use it, and so then it's going to create waste products. And so here are the waste products, CO2 and waste products from metabolism. And so now the waste products have to move from the neuron into these cells, the brown cells right here. And these cells are called microglial cells. They're actually a kind of white blood cell, a leukocyte, and they're going to then dispose of the waste and the CO2. And so what they do is as soon as the CO2 and waste come through from the neuron, then they send it to a capillary, and so it basically cleans up the cells. And so those are the microglial cells. So these are white blood cells sitting around the outside, supporting the neuron. All right, so those are the three associated with the neuron, the neuroglial cells. And so that's adipose CT, and this is loose CT, and this is blood CT because it's a leukocyte, a white blood cell. All right, now there's one more support cell, and it's called an impendable cell. The impendable cells are only found in the spinal canal. And so I drew the spinal canal, and these are actually simple cube ET cells. So I've got it right here, simple cube ET cells. And they're very unusual simple cube ET. They actually have cilia in the inside to help move the cerebrospinal fluid that it's going to make. And on the outside of the cell, on the outside, they have microvilli. Usually microvilli are found in the inside, but now they got microvilli on the outside for adhesion. So it sort of holds on to the nerve tissue right here, the simple QBT, because usually underneath simple QBT is some kind of connective tissue. And so there is no CT underneath here. So the microvilli are holding on to the NT for adhesion. So these cells are called impendable cells, and they make CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, which is high in water, fat, and protein. And so it will diffuse out here into the lumen of these cells right here. And so here is where the CSF is. It will be moved with cilia up and down the spinal cord and to the brain, okay? And we have spaces in the brain that actually use the CSF. And what does the CSF actually do for nerve tissue? It feeds it. It's a source of food for them because it's high in fat and protein. So it's a source of food. And so these are rather unusual cells right here. These simple cubes have cilia on the inside, microvilli on the outside, so it can adhere, the basement membrane can adhere with the microvilli to the nerve tissue and act like a glue in this instant. All right, so those are all our neuroglial cells, our support cells for nerve tissue. This is my homemade neuron, my neuron here. And so I'm holding the neurosoma, this ball, wiffle ball thing. And then I took some straws and made some dendrites in the back. And remember, electricity is always going to move towards the main part of the cell on the dendrites. And then the electricity goes over the neurosoma. And then it's going to hit the axon hill right here, this sticky gummy stuff. And then I have a blue straw in here for the axon, all right? And so on the axon, I have the neuroglial cells known as Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes. And so that white cotton represents fat, okay? And then the little spaces between the fat cells are called the Node of Ranvier, right? The Node of Ranvier. So the electricity will move over the neurosoma, hit the hill, and it'll jump over the fat cell and hit a node over the fat cell, hit the node, hit the node, hit the node, and it goes much faster down the axon when it's insulated with fat cells. What do we call the fat on here one more time? The fat is called myelin, which is a form of cholesterol, like in your foods. And basically at the end of the axon, we have the axon terminals that are gonna hold the neurotransmitter, okay? And so this is just a little homemade model, just to give you the concept. And then also on my other one, I made it a little bit different. And so here is my neurosoma. These are my dendrites right there. And then here's the hill, axon hill, that doesn't have any tubules in it, microtubules, because if you shear off the axon right here, it will never regrow. But if you shear it off here, inside the axon are those microtubules with neurotransmitters. And if you shear it off here, the axon will regrow itself because you've got microtubules and you've got neurotransmitter in there. So it should regrow over time. And then I did a little bit different for my support cells. Sort of the concept is they do wrap all the way around, but they also can look like hot dog buns, and your axon be the hot dog. And so here are the cells right here. And so the Schwann cells are the oligodendrocytes. And then here would be my little terminals out there. And so I just thought this might help put it all together for you. And then all the nerve cells have a synapse between them, because if they touch each other, they would burn each other up with the electricity. So they've got to have that space, and they're unidirectional, and then they're going to all turn with the inner neuron, and then they go back, take the electricity back into the body. So that should help you a little bit, just help visualize it. And one other thing I wanted to show you, I just took a rope and I put some knots in it. And so what this is, if these are like spinal nerves coming out of your spinal cord, all your axons are going to run into, right here, into a ganglia. And a ganglia is like a little mini spinal cord, and it's going to route the electricity through here. And then it goes into the dendrites and the neurosomas. Dendrites and neurosomas are in the ganglia. And then the axons keep running right here, and then they go in here to hit dendrites and the neurosomas, and then more axons come out, and that's how it's going to move the electricity. And then when it gets down to the very bottom, it's going to turn around, and the electricity will come in and go this way. It'll just turn and go back into the spinal cord. So nerves that come out of the spinal cord go out. They're taking the electricity out this way. Those are called, they're exiting, so they're called efferent nerves or motor nerves. And nerves that bring the electricity in towards the spinal cord, those are going to be called afferent or sensory. So this is the end of nerve tissue.